issues, a whole host of issues that most of us are probably in this Zoom room aware of. It's inadequate to the task of meeting the nutritional, sustenance, and cultural needs of most people around the world. And although it has been credited by some with a historically unprecedented expansion in agricultural yields, it is also increasingly acknowledged to cause significant climatic, ecological, social, health-related, and economic harms, some of which I've summarized for you there on the slide. So it's responsible for a large number of greenhouse gas emissions. Some people estimate it to be around 30%. It relies on synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, which contaminate groundwater, contribute to biodiversity loss, and cause damage to the health of farm workers and consumers. It contributes significantly and has contributed to major land use change, which is harmful for ecosystem health and functioning, and also adds to those greenhouse gas emissions. At the top, it fails to nourish the global population and the national population of the UK, and is significantly responsible for a significant amount of worker exploitation as well, just to name a few of its issues. On the other hand, some people have proposed agroecology as an alternative approach to the food system, which would address many of those issues while simultaneously creating thriving ecosystems and societies, both rural and urban. For those of you who haven't heard about agroecology before, it's sometimes described as the ecology of the entire food system. And it's typically defined in terms of principles. So those might be ecological, socioeconomic, and political. And we have one example here on the screen at the moment of some of those principles laid out. So the ones down the bottom half here are some ecological principles. They typically include things like biodiversity, recycling, energy and water efficiency, soil health, and then up the top here we have principles more in the socioeconomic and political realm, so things like human health, gender and other forms of equity, diverse, circular or solidarity economies, autonomy, responsible governance, and collective or participatory decision-making. Agroecology is grounded in traditional ecological farming practices, as well as those findings of modern science and agricultural practice that enhance ecosystems and social well-being. So that's my vision of what a good food system would look like. And so that's where I ground a lot of my analysis. But what does any of this have to do with property, I hear you ask? So a lot of research into barriers to or enablers of transformation to agroecology look at things like education, skills training, consumer awareness, corporate concentration of power, and access to land as key barriers, or on the flip side, key solutions. And those are all really important things, and they are definitely barriers and or solutions. But what they miss out is an engagement with the idea of property itself. And I should acknowledge there are some exceptions to that, but on the whole, at least in the global north, so places like the UK and in New Zealand, where my research also takes place, activist movements are often heavily focused on smallholder-oriented, owner-operated farming as a key solution, which essentially means that they're looking within the existing paradigm of property relations. But I think that a system dominated by private ownership poses a barrier to an agroecological transformation of the food system. I should note at this juncture that that's not an uncontroversial statement. Not everyone agrees with that. And there are many, many people who do a great deal of admirable and important work to pursue an agroecological and generally a fairer and more sustainable food future within the existing property regime. And I draw inspiration from many of them. But I think it's also worth thinking more critically about property, because I think it can help us to understand a key roadblock to making those agroecological futures a reality. So I think we should take another step backwards first before we can go forwards and unpack a bit what property actually is. So property is often colloquially understood as the same thing as ownership. You know, what is property? Well, it's the stuff that I own, I think is how a lot of us might think about this. But legally speaking, property is much more general than that. It's a bundle of rights, and sometimes responsibilities are added in there as well. But it's a bundle of rights that govern the relationships between people with regard to the control, authority over, and use of things in the world around us. I'll say that again because it's a little bit complicated sometimes, but it's a bundle of rights. So think of a bundle of sticks, and that bundle of rights governs the relationships between people with regard to the things in the world around us. It's a set of social and ecological relations that are based on political choices that are legally recognized. Different kinds of bundles pertain to different kinds of property relations, and private ownership is just one kind of many different possible forms of property relations, especially when it comes to land, which is what we're focusing on today. In the UK and in New Zealand and other parts of the global north, the dominant form of property relation is private ownership. And as we've noted, other forms do exist. So it's important to remember from the outset that the ownership model is not somehow natural or a given state of affairs. And people often argue that private ownership produces the conditions for freedom, justice, and democracy. But those arguments, I would argue, typically skim over a large part of the picture. For example, the freedom that comes with private ownership requires a powerful state in order to enforce people's claims to property. It's freedom for owners from others. It's not freedom, especially for non-owners, to do anything. That's the difference between negative and positive freedom, and it's quite an important distinction, I think, especially when it comes to the fulfillment of sort of economic, social, and cultural rights, which we might be concerned with in a response to climate change. Similarly, private ownership produces justice only if justice is conceptualized merely as the retention of property by those who already have it. If we want to think about justice in any kind of more expansive way, then private ownership can struggle to deliver that. Similarly, private ownership enhances democracy, but again, primarily for property owners. There is very little consideration in a property owning democracy for those who do not own property. These kinds of arguments also typically ignore the injustices that were foundational to the initial creation of most modern forms of private ownership, and we'll return to those foundational injustices in a moment. Getting more specifically down to food systems, private ownership may also not be the panacea it's sometimes perceived to be for resolving and overcoming barriers to agroecology. In my work, I argue that this comes down to three key features of private ownership. Firstly, a key feature of private ownership as we understand it today is alienability, that is, the right to sell your land. Implied by this right is the existence of a market upon which the land can be sold. That market creates a situation where the distribution of rights depends on purchasing power, not need, and that in turn tends to drive up the cost of land, excluding potential new farmers from accessing it on the basis of class, wealth, race, gender, or a myriad other intersecting factors. Through the same mechanism, land markets favor large, often institutional investors in land. That drives the concentration of large tracts in the hands of investors who desire it for its exchange value, that is, its ability to produce a profit. Again, this excludes those who would otherwise claim the land for its use value or its ability to provide shelter and produce food. The key thing here is that these dynamics are not a bug that can be adequately resolved through better or freer or friendlier markets, but a central feature of the system of private ownership itself. The second key feature of ownership is that private ownership is predicated on the exclusion of non-owners from accessing and making use of land. When this exclusion is systematized across the landscape, the economy is transformed into one where the means of life, the things people need just to survive, are commodified. That means that they have to be purchased on the market. Increasingly, this forces everyone to depend on the market to obtain the things they need to live. This is sometimes called market dependency. And farmers are affected by market dependency too. Even those who own the land ultimately come to depend on the market for the things they need to live. And this has implications for the choices available to people making decisions about land use. It makes it more difficult to make choices which might be more ecologically positive or socially beneficial if they put the ability of that land user to make a profit at risk, because the profit is necessary to make ends meet to be able to buy the necessities of life on the market. Thirdly, private ownership also gives huge power to landowners to make decisions about what's done on their land. That's why some people call it the castle and moat model of land relations. Communities are excluded from decision-making, making it difficult to achieve the landscape-scale collaboration required for agroecological ecosystems. Regulation can limit this dynamic to some extent, for instance, through the planning system, but there's only so far it can go, and as I'm sure you know, centralized top-down planning is not always a perfect way to regulate local ecosystems. Of course, many private landowners can and do choose to farm agroecologically and to include their communities in different ways in the governance of their land. And once again, many of the most inspiring, hopeful examples of agroecological practice can be found on such farms. But the point is, within the private ownership model, there isn't much of anything to stop someone from choosing otherwise. And I believe that this creates a hurdle to scaling up and systematizing an agroecological food system, especially at the rate needed to address the urgency of the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and deep social crises we face. Yet all of this lies beneath the surface. Private ownership is sort of like the air we breathe. We don't think about it until someone points out that it's there. Excuse me. So as I've alluded to already, private ownership isn't just pragmatically a problem. It also has deep historical and normative issues. But, how did we get to this place where it dominates so absolutely? Back in the 1800s, Karl Marx claimed that capitalism was founded on what he called primitive or original accumulation. This was a process where land and other social goods that had existed outside the capitalist market are brought inside of it in order to support the production of profit. The enclosure of the English commons is often given as the archetypal example of this process, but it's tied up with colonial histories too, from Ireland to New Zealand. As Brenna Banbar tells us, modern property laws emerged along with and through colonial modes of appropriation. Geographer David Harvey later showed that this kind of accumulation wasn't just original, but is still ongoing, what he calls accumulation by dispossession. Importantly, this process of accumulation was and continues to be carried out through coercion, violence, and the law. Over the past several centuries, the law has enabled the creation of a system of private ownership where land is understood as the object of an ownership relation, where it's owned by human subjects. It has been used to transform assets into capital, making them amenable to be used as tools for the accumulation of wealth. And thanks to the centrality of private ownership in well-functioning capitalist markets, it has facilitated the creation of a system of rights in which the right to ownership tends to trump other rights like health or a clean environment. But the complicity of the law goes even deeper than that. Robert Nichols argues that private ownership is actually created through theft. He shows how, in the United States, occupations by settlers of sovereign indigenous territory beyond the westernmost borders of what was then the United States were initially deemed illegal by the settler government. But these illegal squatters were then retroactively transformed into legitimate property owners once they could prove that they had, quote, improved the land by working it, thus dispossessing the former indigenous residents and expanding the territorial boundaries of the settler state in one fell swoop. In New Zealand, where, as I've mentioned, some of my research takes place, this kind of analysis might be applicable to cases like Wiparata and the Bishop of Wellington, an 1877 case. You can see Wiparata here at the bottom on the right, and Justice Prendergast, who heard this case, up the top. In this case, local iwi, or tribe, Ngāti Toa, had given a piece of land to the local Anglican church on the condition that a school be built on it for their children to attend. A school was never built, but the Crown nonetheless issued a grant in the land to the church without the consent of the iwi or tribe. Wiremu, or Wiparata, a Ngāti Toa farmer and politician, brought a case against the church to get the land back, but Chief Justice Prendergast was unmoved. In a now infamous judgment, the Chief Justice ruled that the Treaty of Waitangi, signed between some Māori and the British Crown in 1840 and considered by many today to be a key constitutional document, was a simple nullity. He claimed that Māori were legally incapable of signing the treaty, meaning that it had never been valid in the first place, and even if it had been valid, it had never been incorporated into domestic law, and so could not have any legal standing. In effect, this retroactively gave legal legitimacy to the theft by the church and crown of Ngāti Toa's land, and in doing so, transformed it into privately owned property. Overall, what this brief discussion begins to show us is that the regime of private ownership in land is deeply shaped, perhaps inextricably so, by the interlinked forces of colonial capitalism and the law. This goes well beyond the purely functional explanations of its incompatibility with agroecology to reveal its roots in dispossession, exploitation, and oppression, and thus its normative incompatibility as well. As this regime of ownership and the systems it supports have come to dominate all corners of the globe, or just about, it has become increasingly difficult to imagine other ways of relating to land. Private ownership has a firm hold on how we think about and imagine the land and our relationships with it. For example, research has found that nearly 70% of aspiring farmers in British Columbia ranked private ownership as their ideal type of land arrangement. Legal geographer Nick Blomley calls this imaginative limitation ontological policing, meaning that strict boundaries are drawn around what does and doesn't count as property. Anything beyond those boundaries is made to seem unnatural, unrealistic, or unworkable, or it's dismissed as a leftover from an earlier, less developed time, or a hopelessly naive utopian yearning. Given how central to the modern world private ownership is, and how strong the interests of the state and capital are in maintaining it, it's hardly surprising that even those who stand in opposition to exploitative, extractive models of agriculture sometimes struggle to recognize the role of private ownership in those self-same processes. In fact, I'd argue that this is at least part of the reason why ownership and property are relatively overlooked compared to other barriers to an agroecological transition. What this means is that solutions put forward to create agroecological transitions which fail to grapple with property relations risk undermining their own aspirations from the outset. I think that really chimes with what Sandra was saying at the beginning around the Narratives Lab work and what they do to try to change narratives. So how might we make all these theoretical musings a little more relevant to understanding concrete food system puzzles? Personally, I think that property is a really useful lens to apply when trying to get to the root of different food system issues. For example, thinking about the food system through a property lens helps us to understand better the relationship between food and health. As we've seen, private ownership enables the owner to make more or less unilateral decisions, though these decisions are influenced by powerful market actors like supermarkets, moving production towards what is most profitable rather than other social and economic goals. Even though collectively those production choices tend to have negative effects on personal or ecological health, there's little meaningful action that individuals and communities can take in order to affect them. On the other hand, different forms of property beyond private ownership could enable much more democratic control over such production decisions, allowing for the prioritization of human and other than human health as key outcomes of the food system. On a more conceptual level, we could argue that private ownership puts boundaries at the heart of the way we perceive the world. Seeing the world in terms of boundaries rather than interconnectedness makes it easier to see people as atomized economic actors, self-reliant and self-responsible, isolated from one another and from society more broadly. Boundaries encourage us to think in silos, making it hard to perceive at a systemic level the links between, say, on-farm choices and healthy food choices, other than how they can be linked through purchase. Not only that, but negative consequences of food production and distribution choices are framed as externalities, that is, that they're outside the boundaries of the food system, rather than an integral part of the system. A property lens can also help us to understand apparent food system paradoxes, like why we have so much food waste at the same time that we have such high levels of food poverty. And just before I get into this, I think I'd like to say that it's important to perceive food poverty as simply poverty, but poverty certainly does mean that many people struggle to access adequate, nutritious, and desirable food. So as we've discussed, private ownership is fundamentally premised on the exclusion of non-owners, leading to the present situation where most people can only access food through the wages they earn at work. Except when work is hard to find, difficult for someone to manage due to health or other struggles, or inadequately remunerated, people's access to food can be severely impacted, as we've seen through the meteoric rise in demand for food banks in the UK and elsewhere in the last 15 years. At the same time, private ownership contains this speculative element that we've discussed previously, where the price of land is tied to historical production, speculative value, and potential landowner profit. As the increasing cost of land increases the amount producers must pay for the privilege of working that land, whether as mortgage repayments or rent or both, producers' choices are more and more constrained. Not only does that affect their choices about what and how to produce, it also affects how much they are incentivized to produce. That is, it encourages overproduction, which is one contributing factor to the dramatic food waste situation we see today. So looking through a property lens helps us to see how this so-called paradox is in fact no such thing. These two phenomena, food waste and food poverty, are deeply and systemically linked. But again, other forms of common or collectively managed lands and waters have historically worked to ensure that everyone had access to the basic needs of life, including food. For instance, Elise Bach discusses what this looked like under the Scottish pre-capitalist clanship system. In such a system, we might also see an amelioration of the overproduction incentive, as the speculative nature of land value would no longer be a factor influencing farmer choices. So how might we begin to transform property? One place we might start is to consider looking at property through the regenerative imagination, or to develop a regenerative imagination of property. So what might that mean? Partly, it might mean drawing on historical and contemporary practices, principles, and relations with regard to land, drawing on deep historical or ancestral and recent memories, contemporary understandings and challenges to devise rooted and radical transformative visions for life on the land. Within a regenerative imagination paradigm, these memories and experiences must go beyond those who already have the power, and they must center those who have been historically oppressed and marginalized and dispossessed by the ownership model of property. Another way we might dig into the regenerative imagination of property would be to embrace complexity. Whereas the private ownership model encourages us to simplify and seek control over the world, what might land relations grounded in an appreciation for and respect for complexity and entanglement and relationship look like? Additionally, a regenerative imagination of property might involve centering care. Joan Tronto and Bernice Fisher, two foundational thinkers in the field of care ethics, have defined care as any activity that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment. Care is a tricky concept. However well-intentioned, it isn't always positive. For example, when assumed to be women's work, it can place the burden of caring for people and planet disproportionately on women. It can also disempower the recipient of care, who is assumed to be passive, while the caregiver can be assumed to know best and assume all the power. Private ownership can encourage and enable care. We can see many examples of the deep care that landowners have for their land around us. But I ask, how might private ownership reproduce these troubling dynamics of care? And I invite you to consider how a more regenerative imaginary of property might make space for more empowering and liberatory modes of care for, with, and on the land. How might it, for instance, enable us to see soils not as something that we care for in order to get a better return, but as a respected partner in our work or as kin? But of course, property isn't just in our minds. It has material consequences that influence the way we and others are able to relate to land, to engage with land, to produce and live on the land. It shapes every aspect of our lives. Our regenerative imagination is only effective, in my view, when operationalized through transformative action. My work focuses in particular on the law, whether that's lawmaking, law breaking, or something in between. The law of property, despite the vast power it wields, is ultimately a social construction. It's made by individuals and socially legitimized through recognition and acknowledgement. And just as it has created, legitimized, and upheld a regime of private ownership, so too can it support the development of alternative land relations. There are different ways the law might support this. For example, that might be through legal reforms establishing or supporting community ownership, like what's been seen in Scotland. Or it could be through the establishment of community land ownership within already existing legal structures. We can see this in places like England, with the Ecological Land Cooperative, Biodynamic Land Trust, and others. In the United States, there are examples such as the Agrarian Trust, and many other places around Europe and elsewhere. It might also be through the revitalization in settler colonial contexts, such as New Zealand, of Indigenous land laws and relations, either in spite of or with limited support from the law of the colonial state. And it might even look like active opposition to dominant property laws and norms through interventions like squatting, occupations, and what we've seen recently in England with the Right to Roam campaign. We can also see it in other places, in Indigenous reclamation occupations. And it's also evident in places like Andalusia in Spain, where a local agricultural labor union has occupied land owned by the local municipality, and rather than accepting an offer of ownership of the land, has called instead for land nationalization. So what might that transformed version of ownership look like, or of property, beyond ownership look like? There are many other ways of relating to land beyond the confines of private ownership. One alternative can be found in the theory and practice of the commons, most famously developed by Eleanor Ostrom in 1990. Ostrom showed that sustainable community management of resources was entirely possible under certain conditions or design principles. More radical understandings of the commons go beyond Ostrom's functionalist approach to distinguish between capitalist and anti-capitalist commons and to argue explicitly in favor of practices of commoning that seek to undo the exploitative dynamics of oppression that stifle human and non-human health and flourishing. Perhaps we could see community land ownership in some cases as one example of such commoning practice in the modern day. Another perhaps related alternative is to treat land not as property at all, but rather as a relation, as kin, as something that we belong to rather than something that belongs to us. Some would argue that this isn't just about how we see the land, but that it actually entails a fundamental transformation of what land is. This might look, for instance, like the legal personhood of nature in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where a forest, a river, and a mountain have been turned into legal persons. And it might look like something else entirely. As Kierkegaard put it, what we own, we cannot sell, and what we sell, we do not own. Of course, this is not a new idea, but in fact, a core element of many Indigenous and traditional worldviews from all around the world, including the UK. In rejecting the commodification and enclosure of land as property, these two alternative land regimes may present possible ways of enacting what you might call a regenerative imagination. So just to conclude briefly, what I hope you might take away from this talk is that private ownership is not necessarily desirable as a basis for the land system or the food system, and that this is particularly the case if we're to build agroecological futures. I'd add to that the modern regime of property dominated by private ownership is constructed upon colonial capitalist foundations and is rooted in dispossession, exploitation, and oppression. But it doesn't have to be this way. Radical, regenerative, emancipatory, liberatory alternatives are possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was just going to say I have questions, but also I'm welcome questions from the audience.
Great, thank you very much. If people here can put their videos on, if that doesn't harm their broadband width or whatever it is that it harms, that would be great. And yeah, so thank you very much, Olivia. That was a lot to take in and quite inspiring. And there's a question first of all from Mark. Go ahead, Mark.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Firstly, thank you, Olivia. I thought was absolutely brilliant. Really enjoyed that, and as the comment says from Alison in the box, it's very thought-provoking and lots to take away. The thing that struck me from the beginning is just recently read Koei Sato's book on Slow Down, where he mentions at the beginning how there's this narrative that if things are held in common, that actually they're just plundered. So it's sort of known as the tragedy of the commons, where he says actually the reality is what we've got is a sort of tragedy of commodity, that once you make it private, that's when it's asset stripped and when things are done for profit and it's not focused on what is generally for the common good. So I thought that rang a bell with me on that one. The thing that I struggle with on this is, again, I suppose it comes down to that narrative point, is land is almost one of the last great things that we seem reluctant to face up to. So, you know, public opinions now have sort of swung back towards thinking that things like energy and rail and post and other things, you know, would be better managed some kind of public social ownership. But land is always the one that sort of, we never sort of talk about that. And in some ways you can see sort of the logic of where, you know, internationally you could, well, it would be difficult, but you could start making moves at sort of decolonialized places and things. But if we bring it to a Dorset level, where I forget the numbers, but there's something like 6 families own sort of 50% of the land or something, like I can't remember the exact figure, but it's a sizable chunk. And, you know, one of them was one of the biggest ones was given to somebody because they picked the right side in the Civil War. And then they've now made all their money through slavery, and still sits there, surrounded by one of the longest walls in England. And that's always been a thing. Every time we've sort of thought about how do you transform the food system in the area, how do we actually influence that? And also just things like where you put up renewable energy installations and things like that are also restricted by who owns the land. I guess it's sort of just maybe delving in a little bit to that point about how can we start to change that narrative and wrestle back that land from somebody who effectively stole it in the first place.
Hi, Mark. Thanks. Great question. Lots in there. So hopefully I'll be able to address some parts.
Sorry, it was a bit much. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And just if there's bits that I miss, you can just remind me. But yeah, I think it's kind of the $1 million question, isn't it? Like, how do we fix that? Because ultimately the people who hold all the power are also the land owners, so they don't want to give that up. But I think, and I do think the law is one way of engaging with this. So if you look north of the border in Scotland, I think the example there of the land reform that they've had over the last 25 years since devolution is very inspiring. The way that they've opened the door for a community right to buy and state support around that. But at the same time, I can also see how looking at that from the vantage point of England and having Westminster as your parliament might sort of seem like a bit of a pipe dream. But I think the discourse is changing, and I think it's important to remember that land nationalisation was on the Labour Party's agenda until well into the middle of the 20th century. So this hasn't always been off the table. It did used to be on the table, and I think I see it coming back onto the table now in terms of political discourse and narrative shift. So I would say lending your voice to that broader narrative shift around land and land justice that's going on. And it's happening in a lot of spheres. So there's the Right to Roam campaign that I mentioned, but also there's a sort of upsurge of all sorts of like tenant action work. There's people, sort of diasporist groups working in the UK thinking about, well, what does decolonization mean for land access here in the UK? We can think of many different, all aspects of life are connected to land in some way. And I would say I definitely see glimmers of a burgeoning coalescence of all those different movements around the idea of land justice. So I would say contributing to that shifting narrative there and the centrality of land to all of those struggles and the way it connects them would be a really beneficial place to start. But also, if you're bold enough, I mentioned both the law changing, law loopholes, and law breaking. So I don't condone any illegal action because it's being recorded. But there are many examples around the world of how, for instance, occupations and other forms of civil disobedience have been effective in sort of forcing open that narrative shift. In particular, even further, and sometimes achieving more material change as well. Hopefully that addresses the aspects of your question that you're interested in. Okay, cool.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've got a question from Nandawa and then Giles, please.
I've got 2 points to make. One is that man is an agriculturalist, but we also have a very strong yen for nomadism. There are many of us who really prefer to be on the road. And of course, land ownership precludes that, but people usually find ways around it. And I think it's quite a strong genetic feature within us that we also need nomadism. But the other point is that perhaps it's very, very small scale, so you haven't noticed it, but we do have allotments in this country, which are usually on publicly owned land, and people do produce their own food, or a certain amount of it. And I think that is an example that should not be forgotten. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nan. Two really great points. I think the point about nomadism, I think really strongly connects to land ownership. I think in the UK, as you say, sometimes people find ways around that, especially around recreational access and walking in particular. But I think it's really pertinent with regard to food systems as well. If we look internationally, we see the restriction of nomadic pastoralists' abilities to exercise their traditional grazing practices, which have taken them across very large areas of land. As that land is enclosed and privatized, it's much more difficult or becomes impossible for those ways of life and those forms of food production to continue to exist. So I think it's a point very well made, that this is not just about sedentary agriculture, but other forms of engaging with and relating to and living from the land. And to your second point, absolutely, allotments are great, and so is public land. I certainly am not opposed to either of those, and I think they're brilliant. I think what we see in the UK, at least, are cripplingly long waiting lists. There, I really recommend anyone who hasn't read Brett Christopher's book on the new enclosures and the privatization of public land in Britain. It's a really good book on looking at the sale and the privatization of a great deal of British public land, including allotment land. And so I think I completely agree with you, and that's just another front of the battles that need to be need to be fought, in my perspective, on this point. Yeah, thanks, Nan.
Giles and then Ian.
I tried to think how to make it a bit more tractable, and I mean, one of your premises was that
Oops, you're cutting out, Giles.
any chance of can you hear me okay?
I
Shall
heard that,
switch off
but I
my
haven't
video?
heard the rest of it.
Can
Sorry.
Try
Can
again,
you still
Giles.
hear me? Can you hear me
Yeah,
now?
that's good. Try again. Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me now, can you? Right, nodding. Okay. Tell me if it cuts out again. I'm sorry to have to cut off my camera. You mentioned about the legal, needing to transform the legal side. And I feel that before you do that, you're really going to have to transform the political side. That's really the way to make inroads into this. And if we bring it down to the local scale, the local politics, the biggest influence over land is through the council's planning schemes. And, we are, as DCAM, we are engaged with that at the moment in trying to influence how the land is managed. And it seems to me that one of the biggest problems we have is with the planning system, the way it is structured and designed to favour sort of very large land owners and very large sort of builders. So I think the very first thing we've probably got to try and do is to come up with a scheme of much better planning of our own land. And one of the suggestions is that we need to have a scheme a long-term scheme of the structuring what land is used for. So rather than just having very short-termism of looking at land and how it's divided up, trying to look at how you structure, how much land do we need for farm, how much land do we need for houses, how much land do we need for renewable energy, etc. And then trying to have some strategic approach to getting to that position. And I think that's maybe something that's a bit more tractable to do in the short term, rather than what you've described, which is perhaps the end point, but seems so difficult to tackle because it's so far away from where we are at the moment. Sorry for a very long and slightly rambling statement.
That's all right. That's all right, Giles. Thank you very much for your point, for your comment. I really appreciate it, and like totally agree. The planning system is a huge barrier. I mean, I think also we can look at when the legislation around that was first passed, and that was a really significant piece of land reform. So we can also maybe take inspiration from its existence, even though it doesn't now work in a way that is useful to what most of us in this room might like to achieve. And I completely agree that these things seem very tractable. And I think a few things that your comment brings to mind. One is the idea of non-reformist reform. And so that's sort of where I currently see my work sitting. So what you're talking about is sort of what can we do that feels tractable at a sort of local level, at a sort of medium-term horizon now. And I suppose my work tries to encourage us to continue to retain that long-term transformative or revolutionary perspective within those sort of medium short-term reforms, so that we don't just get the reform and then say, oh yeah, job well done, when we haven't finished the transformation. So I would say I'm absolutely in favor of looking to the more doable tasks, in particular around local planning changes, and that I would just encourage those who are undertaking those to do those with a view to that being the first step on a longer journey of transformation of our property relations and our economy. And the other thing it brought to mind, and you may well already be very familiar with it, is the Food Farming and Countryside Commission's work on land use framework. And so that really resonated with what you were saying around the need for sort of joined up thinking around actually, you know, how do we want this land to be used, and what do we want our planning system to be creating in our landscapes. So if that's not something you're familiar with, I'd really recommend having a look at their work. They've done some case study pilots, I believe, in Devon and Cambridgeshire. So might be worth getting in touch with them.
Could you put something in a link in the chat on that, please?
I'll
Thank you.
see if I can find one.
Thank you, Olivia.
Thanks very much, Giles. And yeah, Ian, put your hand up.
Yeah, well, one of the books I've read and enjoyed most in the last year or so was the Nick Hayes book on the well, I forgot what the title is now, something, the Book of Trespass, and he looks obviously back at the way the land was appropriated from the commons by landowners, and the amount of how little land is now accessible to us all. In fact, they recently renamed the AONB's national landscapes, and somebody just worked out that actually only about 8% of the national landscapes is accessible by people. Yeah, because most of it is owned by somebody else and there's no access, even though it's a national landscape. So anyway, one of the things which Nick Hayes points out is that our attitudes to private property are probably driven by our own ownership of our houses, and therefore we sort of upscale that to other, landowners' property and the rights to do what they want. And it's a bit like Margaret Thatcher, introducing neoliberalism by comparing a national economy to your own private, your own household economy, and the wrong thinking that starts. And really, we've got to unthink the attitude towards land as being an extension of our own particular private property. And perhaps Giles' idea that planning and looking at what goes on land is perhaps the way around that, because in the end, it doesn't really so much matter who owns it, it's a matter of who controls what goes on it. And that's the crux. And that's easier perhaps to make more tractable than the actual ownership.
Yeah, I think, thank you, really really appreciate your comment, Ian. And yeah, it's a great book. I love that book. Glad you enjoyed it as well. And yeah, I mean, he's absolutely bang on the money about home ownership. I mean, you referred to Thatcher, and I mean, it was her explicit, that was the sort of thinking behind the sell-off of public housing. You make everyone a homeowner, you make everyone defend property ownership, because suddenly they have a stake in it. So you're absolutely right about that. In terms of your point about ownership and control, yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, because in some ways ownership is, you say ownership, it doesn't matter who owns it. It matters who controls it, but of course the owner controls it. But I think there is an interesting question there, and that's why I think, even though sometimes it can be a little bit sort of apolitical and legalistic, this idea of the bundle of rights notion of property is quite useful, because I think it almost allows you to think about, well, how might we transform property through the back door, if you want, for example, with planning, if we had a planning system that worked for the people rather than for owners, is there a point at which you have regulated private ownership so heavily and introduced so much public participation in planning decisions that maybe it still has the name private ownership, but it no longer really is private ownership in the way we conceive of it today? So I think there's some interesting possible conceptualizations of how we might go about making some of those changes within that idea of the bundle of rights, insofar as it allows us to think, well, which ones can we pull out and which ones can we sort of sneak in, and then at what point does the elephant stop looking like an elephant and start looking like something else? So I think you're on mute there, Ian, but hope that speaks to your comment.
You're on mute, Ian. Ian?
Having finished speaking.
Okay.
Yes, if all property rights are bundled together, you can't separate out the ownership from what actually goes on. And if you could, then you start to affect what actually happens on land, and who actually can direct what happens on land as well. So you immediately remove all the trump cards from the owner.
Exactly, and I think we can look to inspiration from history in the UK, but also around the world, to look at many diverse examples of different ways that those sticks have been bundled, if you like, with different sort of overlapping forms of authority, decision making, power, access rights, use rights at different times, in different seasons, for different people from different groups. There's sort of almost limitless possibilities for how we might configure that bundle. So I think it can be quite useful for sparking imagination and ideas about how we might do property differently.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. And Mark, your hand's up.
Yeah, I know I've had a turn, so if anyone else don't want to jump in, I mean,
Go for
if
it.
not, I will.
You're all right at the moment.
Yeah, so it sort of follows on from Giles, actually. I remember it must be about 12, 13 years ago, being at a talk that Caroline Lucas gave, and one of the questions came out from the audience, which was effectively, if fundamentally it's sort of capitalism and neoliberalism driving the climate crisis, then shouldn't we be focused really on addressing that political issue rather than having campaigns around the climate? And her answer at that time was, as much as she feels that it would be good to overthrow capitalism, the climate crisis isn't going to wait for us to do that, which is sort of seemed a reasonable answer. And I guess now 12 years down the line, and we still haven't got the emergency plans in place that we should do. So it sort of calls into question whether actually, there is a different approach. And I do wonder whether sometimes we look at problems as being about technical. technical issues. So, you know, well, if we stop powering by oil and gas and switch to solar panels and turbines, that'll do that. If we switch to electric vehicles and more buses, then we've solved that problem. But I think what I'm hearing from you, Olivia, was very much about how, while the interim solutions, like the sorts of things you discuss with Giles, are actually the sort of tactical things you can take forward now, it's probably, or I guess the question is, should we constantly, among those discussions, continue to raise the fact that there's a fundamental systemic problem here tied up with the economy and ownership and politics, that if we don't address that as well, then we're never really going to fundamentally solve these problems?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point and a really good question. And I think this is the eternal debate. And I know, you know, the psychologists and the behavior, you know, everyone has a different take on, you know, what the best approach to messaging is on this. I mean, I personally, my perspective on this is that it is a fundamentally political question. It's not a tech, we have the technologies. It's absolutely nothing to do with the technology, really. It's inherently and fundamentally political, and that becomes increasingly apparent day by day. So from my perspective, it is important to continue to raise that deeply political nature of things, not only because it's so clear that it's not a lack of technology that's holding us back, but also because and this comes to your question about urgency and the timeframes of things as well, that I believe that if we throw the sort of political, sort of more difficult subjects out with the bathwater and just say, all right, we just need to get this technical change through, no matter what the sort of ownership or social political configuration is, I guess I just don't think that gets us a much better world. And I think it's, you know, it's difficult to envisage how the world we get, if that's the approach we take, is better, not only for people, but also for much of the planet. You know, it seems to me that every time we pursue purely technical solutions, they end up actually not solving any of the problems anyway. If we look at sort of the facade of carbon credit, and the marketization of those, or biodiversity credits, which do still exist remarkably. You know, the idea that, you know, you can destroy that wetland if you re-wet, you know, if you plant some trees over here or something like that. You know, it's completely unhinged. But I think that is sometimes what we can expect if we fail to focus on the political as well as it is a technical challenge as well, but it's not that we don't have those tools and solutions. So yeah, it's difficult because then some other people will turn around and say, well, you'll just alienate people if you talk about politics when you're talking about climate, and if you want the Tories on board, then you don't, you know, blah blah blah. So it's a difficult one. But my perspective is that the politics is a fundamental part of it.
Thank you, Olivia. That's great, and thank you for the question or the comment, Mark. It's great to hear that exchange. And Andrew.
Thank you, Olivia. And I mean, this is a really interesting discussion about how to start a revolution, which is always tricky, especially when most of the people who used to do revolutions now vote Conservative or in some other way mortgaged into the system so that they can't. And I was waiting for you to talk about the rights of nature, and then you did. And I'm wondering, I've got interested in this recently in terms of giving rights to a river, which of course you've done to the Wanganui, for the Wanganui. And I'm wondering if you think that actually, because a lot of people who would join the National Trust or the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds or whatever might, if they weren't paying too close attention. Just say, yeah, I think rivers should have rights. I think mountains should have rights. I think forests should have rights. It kind of appeals on an emotional level to people who otherwise would be aggressively attached to barbed wiring their gardens. Whether you think that working on the rights of nature movement and pushing for that might be a kind of Menshevik way to get a revolution, because enough people feel the horror of their river having no fish in it, or being full of shit, or their forest having no birds in it. If whether that, you were just talking about not dropping the politics and so on, whether you feel that could be a driving way forwards.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's a really interesting developing space. I'm definitely not an expert in rights of nature, so my focus in my work is on community land ownership, which is a bit different, but I think it's another one of those really difficult ones where what I do know of it is that there are very different opinions. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I know that it's quite different from where countries have given rights to nature in other countries, because there it was driven by an Indigenous reparations process. So personhood was given to the Wanganui, to the Wera Forest, and more recently to Taranaki Maunga Mountain as part of reparations for colonial wrongs. And so it's fundamentally driven by the recognition of the Indigenous relationship with those landscapes, which is an ancestral kinship-based relationship. I think, again, my understanding is quite limited here, but from what I understand of where legal personhood has been implemented elsewhere, it's been primarily based around conservation, and has sometimes perpetuated a sort of fortress conservation mentality, which is very exclusionary of people, and also just hasn't necessarily always been particularly effective. So I would say it would depend on how you went about promoting that, but especially if it was grounded in a fundamentally different way of conceiving of the relationship with land. I can imagine that might be a useful avenue to pursue. Yeah, but I can't say too much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we've got time for one or two more questions. Maya, your hand's up. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Forgive me if it's a bit rambling, but in a sense, all of us that are gathered here today, are all believing in the same thing, and we haven't got a problem with what you're saying or what we all think together. But on the radio this evening, and I know the media is so skewed towards whatever it wants to say on a particular day, but they had some vox pop with people about heat source pumps and all the rest of it, and the number of people who seem to be completely and utterly unaware that these things exist. And the trouble is, how do we tell people who don't know that they can know this? It's a bit of a stupid question, but
not a stupid question at all. I think it's a really difficult one. I think it's really, really difficult, especially because some of this stuff is so legalized and formalized, and it feel, the law and ownership and property, and it all feels so complicated and difficult to get into, especially in the UK, where it's all so archaic and you don't have a central register of property, which is like blows my mind. So people can't even know who owns what, at least very easily. So it's not a stupid question at all, and I think I think probably my sense would be the best way to communicate this to people is through emphasizing the way that property relations and land relations and ownership are at the heart of whatever it is that they care about. So, I mean, you were saying that the interview was about air source heat pumps, but say it was about ownership. And presumably most of those people rent a house. So can you connect that, you know, okay, has your rent gone up a lot lately? Why is that? Why does your landlord have the power to set what you pay for a roof over your head, even when that roof might be pretty crap, and cold and damp? You know, trying, or if what people are caring about is that, you know, hungry, you know, why is it that you have no control over what's produced and what you get to eat, and you can't make ends meet, and trying to find the ways to tie the issues that are close to people's hearts back to ownership. So that's kind of on a big picture sort of policy level, you know, okay, do you care about housing? Do you care about food? Do you care about the rights of nature, say, whatever it might be? But then also I've seen some really great examples of more localized campaign, like whether it's land occupations that I've seen cases of, or in Scotland, campaigns for the community to buy the land using the legislation that they have there. But even, you know, that's happened in England as well, even without the supporting legislation. There are ways for communities to buy land, or all of these different sort of localized struggles, trying to make sure that where you're involved with those, the conversation reflects that this is not just a question of access or community development or whatever the other motivations might be, but that it is also a question of property relations and private ownership, and trying to tie everything back to it, I would say, and make it relevant to people. But yeah, I mean, the communication issue is a huge hurdle, and you're absolutely right to raise it. And I think we just all had to keep banging the drum.
Yeah. I just think we need more local, small scale groundswell stuff. Because what we're faced with on a daily basis in the last few months and continuously really is examples of nation states land grabbing.
Exactly.
And we all know who's doing that at the moment. And we all know who's done it in the past, and we all know who's going to do it in the future. So in that harks back to someone's comment about the politics. We have to forget that, in a sense. Has to become almost an irrelevance, I think, and we have to concentrate on local issues that affect everybody within a, you know, whatever, 5 mile, 10 mile, 15-minute city radius, whatever it might be. Sorry, I'm going to shut up because otherwise.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, yeah. I mean, I imagine we're running out of time, Sandra, but
thank you.
I think it's a really interesting comment, and I think the two things I would say to that is, one, that politics is not the same as politicians and nation states, and that we can keep the politics in even if it is at a more local scale. And secondly, I agree that you can't manufacture a movement. That movements have to be grounded in where people are and what they care about, and often that is really local issues, but also that movements don't come out of unconnected upswells of activity, that they come out of intentionally connected sites of activity. So I would say, yes, focus on what is concrete and local and grounded, if that is what matters to you and are the issues that are affecting your life. But I would encourage anyone working at that scale to also ensure that they are connecting with others who are struggling against the same issues elsewhere, and different issues, and drawing those links through the lens of property.
Thank you very much. And Olivia, I'm going to just push you one more inch to a question in the chat. which will take you back to legal roots.
Mm.
You could.
Does Alison, I'm not sure if you're there, but do you have a particular sort of law around stewardship that you're referring to there, or is it
Not
just
particularly,
in
but
general?
I've worked in the charity sector for a long time, and the notion of stewardship is quite heavy there and
Mm.
useful, I think, and it talks very much to future beneficiaries, which helps us with all kind of climate change and eco aspects. And so I'm just wondering if that helps us. Is there any legal status that we could call on and think about and draw upon?
Yeah, I mean, not that I'm aware of just sort of independently on its own. But what I would say, and something that you're probably aware of from that background, is that obviously trusts and trustees have a sort of stewardship type duty to whoever it is that their beneficiaries are. And so any trust with beneficiaries that are sort of the general public or the environment or that kind of thing, then obviously stewardship is going to be a part of that. And actually, you know, that is what a lot of these community owned lands end up looking like, is legally speaking a trust of some kind or a company with charitable purposes, those kinds of things. So in that regard, definitely, I think those legal vehicles that already exist can incorporate this idea of stewardship within their sort of constitutions or charitable purposes, and then that is legally enforceable. I think thinking about law more broadly, if I think about Indigenous land relations in New Zealand, they are fundamentally premised upon the principle of kaitiakitanga, which means guardianship or stewardship. And so that brings us back to this sort of transformation of what our property relations are intended to do and how we relate to land, and embedding that in whatever our property relations are. So, you know, do we own the land or do we steward it? Do we, you know, does it belong to us or do we belong to it? And so it's a bit of a rambling answer, because I don't think there's any sort of legal enforceability there, but embedding that in, I say, regenerative imagination of property, if that's how we want to think about it, embedding stewardship, guardianship, whatever it might be in that, I think is really important. Just to bring it back to one of the other questions that was asked around legal personhood of nature, I have a colleague who sits on the board of the Te Urewera forest, the forest that owns itself, and they have not a resource management plan, but a people management plan. And so, you know, that's how they sort of act as stewards, is that they actually steward the people, not the resource, the forest. So I think maybe, you know, if we're thinking about trying to push legal personhood, you know, embedding stewardship in that in different ways. Also, just thinking about our organizational structures that we already have. I've had conversations with other colleagues about, you know, how do we plan for 7 generations in the future or 500 years in the future, and trying to embed that long-term intergenerational thinking into the structures that we have today. It could be another one of these sort of non-reformist reforms where, you know, if it stops there, then it's maybe not transformative, but if it's the first step towards a broader transformation, then potentially, you know, you can see how that is contributing to a real shift in property relations and land relations.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question, Alison.
Thanks, Alison.
So I'm just going to wind us up there and say, Olivia, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful presentation and really like a breath of fresh air in terms of we're often just, you know, dealing with the next crisis or trying to do the next project or trying to keep everything rolling. And it's just wonderful to be able to step back and have so many sort of thought-provoking ideas given to us. So really, on behalf of everybody, can we do one of those hands things that I forgot to mention at the beginning, to just say thank you so much, so that for your time as well and your generosity and all the questions you've taken. So thank you, and thank you to everybody for coming this evening, and do sign up to be a member of Dorset Can if you're not already. And otherwise, I wish you a good evening.
Good night.
Good night.